Today I'll be discussing the changes Judaism went through as a result of powers over them shifting from Persian rule to Greek and then to Roman. The Persian period began with Cyrus the Great liberating the Jewish peoples from Babylonian rule in 538 BCE. Under his rule, Cyrus gave the conquered people a great deal of freedom as long as they paid homage to his reign. He allowed for the Second Temple to be rebuilt and was very tolerant of other worship, namely Jewish and Babylonian. There was this notion that he was divinely appointed, which comes from Ezra 1 and Isaiah, which elaborate on the narrative that Cyrus was divinely appointed and that his actions were ordained by God. Cyrus's goal from God was to reestablish the beginnings of Judaism, which was done through the reestablishment of the Second Temple. The Cyrus Cylinder, a historical text, aligns with biblical texts Ezra and Isaiah. It gives these texts more authority because it sets Cyrus up in a similar way to how he was set up in the Bible, which shows him as a liberator. The historical evidence of the Cyrus Cylinder solidified the image of Cyrus in these religious texts. The Greek period began when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 331 to 332 BCE. When he died in 322 BCE, his kingdom was divided among his generals. The Hellenistic period began when Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire and ends in 70 CE with the destruction of the Second Temple. One of the key events during this period was the creation of the Septuagint, a translation of the Bible from Hebrew into Greek. Its influence is seen in early Christianity because the New Testament translation relied on it, and it was composed through the 3rd century BCE and was in circulation by the end of the Hellenistic rule. Under the Hellenistic rule, Jewish people in Judea were less affected by Hellenism, but still had a strong Hellenistic influence, for example, the additional freedoms of women. Greek interpretations of Judaism often tied biblical figures to Greek concepts such as philosophy. For example, in Philo's Life of Moses, he represents Moses as the originator of philosophy. Writings like this and other apologetics aim to show Jewish contributions to Hellenistic society as a response to the rise in anti-Judaism texts. Philo's focus on the Torah as an allegory allowed him to meld Judaism and Hellenism in his own form of hermeneutics. During and after Alexander, there was general peace in Judea. The rule during this period went from Alexander the Great to the Ptolemaic regime to the Seleucids, and during the Seleucid rule, there was a division among early Jewish people on a response to a foreign culture. The Seleucids tried to force Jewish people to give up their laws and forsake their God, as explained in Patrick Buchel's The Septuagintopedia and the Construction of Jewish Identity during the late Hellenistic and early Roman period. During the Seleucid rule, the Maccabean revolt took place from 175 to 134 BCE. Jewish identity against Greek identity set the stage for this when Antiochus IV reclaimed Judea in 169 BCE. These events are recounted in the Hanukkah story in 1 Maccabees, as detailed in Teresa Rajic's The Jewish Diaspora in Greco-Roman Antiquity. During the revolt, different rulers tried to institute Hellenistic reforms on the religious and cultural life of Judea. Antiochus IV continued this, but with a high level of imperial oppression and violence, as explained in John Campian's Diversity, Resistance, and Survival in the Second Temple, Judaism, Jewish Identity under Greco-Roman Rule and its implications for the Korean Peninsula. The events of this time period shaped Judaism as they now had a new translation of the Bible and a new form of literature, as well as the basis for the coming events during the Roman rule. During the Roman rule, the security and safety of the Jewish peoples depended on who the emperor of Rome was during that time. During this period, anti-Judaism and anti-Jewish sentiments grew, but more so from an anti-religion perspective. The Roman Empire did not see the Jewish as a threat, and the Jewish were not necessarily targeted, but in the events leading up to the First Jewish War, the destruction of the Second Temple, and the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jewish were under a perceived threat by the Romans. Though the Jewish were not a large threat to the Romans believed they were worthy of expulsion. The Jewish were strongly associated with astrology, witchcraft, soothsayers, who were considered threats under the Roman rule. The majority of Romans were not concerned with the Jewish because they did not see the monotheism of Judaism as a threat to their polytheism. During the Roman period, there was an emergence of rabbinic Judaism, and up until the destruction of the Second Temple, there are various sects of Judaism which followed the Hebrew Bible, but in different ways through different ways of worship and interpretations, and were not necessarily Jewish, but were connected to early Israelite religion and traditions. During this period, there weren't many physical markers of Jewish people, but circumcision was the main marker to outsiders in certain public spaces. This is one of the ways the Romans were able to identify and target Jewish men, as explained in Tessa Radrich's The Jewish Diaspora in Greco-Roman Antiquity. The key events under Roman rule were the First Jewish War, the destruction of the Second Temple, and the Bar Kokhba Revolt. The First Jewish War took place from 66 to 74 CE. The reigns of Caligula, who put statues of himself in the Second Temple, and Nero, a tyrannical ruler who blamed an early Jewish sect, namely Christianity, for setting fire to Rome in 64 CE, were immediately before the start of this war. These reigns contextualize the discomfort of Jewish people in Rome and the realization that they could not be self-actualizing under Rome. In the year before the destruction of the temple, there was the year of the 4 emperors. Nero was the emperor during the beginning of the First Jewish War, and after his death, there was a civil war which caused a great deal of unrest in Rome. During this war, the Romans chose to starve out the Jerusalemites as they blocked off supply lines by surrounding Jerusalem. The Masada, which took place from 72 to 74 CE, was a Jewish rebellion that continued for about 3 years after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. The Masada was the final event of the Jewish War. The Zealots were a Jewish group that led the rebellion against Rome during the First Jewish War and continued through the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70 CE. The temple was ransacked by Roman soldiers and the items taken from the temple were used to display Rome's victory over the Jewish people. After the destruction, majority of the Jewish sects disappeared and rabbinic Judaism became the main thread of Judaism. Christianity emerged after the end of the Jewish War and the destruction of the temple. Before these events, Christianity was a sect of Judaism, but began to separate themselves afterwards. Judaism shifted towards synagogues as a center of their worship in Jewish life and community after the destruction of the temple, which centralized the religion in Jerusalem. There's a debate today around whether the Jewish community would want a third temple to re-centralize their worship. A longing for this was mostly on the part of rabbinic Judaism, but was not a very popular view among the rest of the Jewish community. The Bar Kokhba Revolt, which took place from 132 to 136 CE, was also known as the Second Jewish War. During this war, a messianic figure under the rule of Hadrian led the revolt. The Romans were able to put an end to this revolt relatively quickly, and the Jewish were exiled after this. This set in motion the diaspora, which is considered to be the great dispersion that took place after the last attempt of the Jewish community to reclaim their homeland. These events led to a different way of being due to no longer having a centralized place of worship for the religion and being exiled once again from their homeland. When the focus shifted to the synagogues from the destruction of the temple, the first and second temples were memorialized in numerous ways, such as the creation of certain rituals to honor and remember the destruction, as illustrated in J.D. Cohen's The Temple and the Synagogue. As discussed in this presentation, Jewish people had more freedom in the Persian period and the early Roman period. The events under the Roman rule shaped Judaism as what we know today. After the destruction of the temple, rabbinic Judaism flourished, Christianity began to emerge, and the majority of other Jewish sects were destroyed and eliminated. The Greek and Roman period started relatively peaceful for the Jewish people, but due to increasing anti-Judaism sentiments, threats, both perceived and real, grew as well, which led to the emergence of apologetic literatures, an attempt to change the narrative around Jewish people and make Hellenistic society more accepting of them. In present-day Judaism, the destruction of the temple is memorialized in everyday life to show the incompleteness of the universe without the temple.